All right, cool. Thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me
Of
again.
course, yeah. I like your shirt there. Did that say Panavision?
It sure does.
Why is that?
Because I asked one of the people in the camera department at my job, I was like,
Oh,
can I have
okay.
one? I was like, where do I get one of those shirts? And then he brought me one.
That's pretty sweet. That's awesome. How are you doing? It's been a minute.
I'm doing fine most of the time.
You're pretty busy?
Um, yeah, I've been
Mm-hmm.
crazy busy, so it's just been insane going from
Mm-hmm.
like taking it easier for 6 months or however long I was in New Mexico for 4 months.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, I was off of work for about 6 months total. Of course, I was doing other stuff during that time, but
Mm-hmm.
jumping back into like the intense 70-hour work weeks has been a lot. Um,
Yeah, I can imagine.
yeah. Luckily, so I'm working on a Netflix show right now. They're being super safe as
Good.
we can be with COVID
Yeah,
stuff. Like we're
yeah.
getting tested multiple times a week. There's a whole health and safety team. There's a lot of new protocols. We all have to wear like a lot of PPE, but so I'm grateful that they're taking all those measures. But
Mm-hmm.
it's been a lot. It's a big adjustment,
Yeah.
and I was only working in film for about 6 months before COVID hit. So it's like everyone else seems to be like jumping back into their routine. And I'm kind of like, I've just been in this like constant state of like
Mm-hmm.
adjusting, but
Mm-hmm.
that's life. So I'm
Yeah, I mean
just,
it is life, but you're like it's cool that you're back to work, right? I
yeah,
think that's pretty neat. I think so many of us took for granted the film industry and all these productions because that's literally all we can do these days,
yeah.
right? Is watch TV or something or other. And so thank you for getting out there. I mean, I know it's not
Yeah,
easy, and it's a lot of work. People also don't realize, and I've said this to a ton of people in the industry on the podcast. It's a lot of work to put something together, whether it's even the podcast or any production of any sort. There's so many people, there's so many moving parts, and people just take it for granted a lot of the time. But it's again, it takes
absolutely.
people
Yeah.
like you who sacrificed a lot of their time 70 hour work weeks, right? And that's a lot.
It's intense. And I feel it's like a lot of days I feel like my job isn't even that hard.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's so many moving parts. And like you said, I mean now I've been trying to like I just got a Nintendo Switch. Somebody at work gifted it to me because I can't watch TV anymore. Because now when I'm watching TV, I like can't just focus on the
Well,
story.
oh, it's because you're just thinking of like the production, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm like, there's somebody behind that wall eating at the craft service table.
Yeah.
And it's a whole thing. No, I know what you mean. I know what you mean. It kind of does take away the illusion a little bit.
Yeah.
Um, so so I mean, you left New Mexico obviously recently, and so you're back out there. A big part of why I wanted to bring you on, for one, I think you're really cool and I adore you, right?
Thank you.
And two, it's Native American Heritage Month, and I was considering, I was thinking I did something for Hispanic Heritage Month where I had like a few different people on and we discussed different things. But I really wanted to bring somebody on and not just talk about history, because a lot of
Totally.
us know a lot about the history, right? But none of us really discuss or know about the contemporary stories of Native American people or just your lives, like what
Yeah.
it's like to be a Native American person in the US in 2020.
And I think that's a great point because a lot of the time when Native people are talked about, it's in
Hmm.
the past tense, right? Like
Yeah,
we
yeah,
talk about what happened. And of course, this year, especially, I think a lot of non POC folks are finally like coming
yeah.
to terms with how this country was founded. So, like, a lot of, we're always talking about the history of Native people. And of course, that's
Hmm.
important. But
Hmm.
I think when we only do that, we neglect talking about them, yeah, in the present tense. And it's been a
Yeah.
crazy experience for me. Like, and I'm still working with Pueblo Action Alliance too. I'm like
Yeah,
still
yeah,
doing work for them on top of it.
yeah,
But yeah, it was just crazy, like being home, being around Indigenous people, and like feeling at home because that's, you know, where I grew up. And
yeah. Mm.
then coming back to New York, where like some people legitimately do not know that Native American people still exist. It's astounding to me.
So I mean, that's a because there is it is spoken about in the past tense, right? So it's an erasure of a people currently existing for one, and then two, I mean, there's so many myths around like Thanksgiving and all this BS,
Yeah,
right? And
totally.
Columbus Day and other holidays. So yeah, I mean, I'd had that experience where people are asking me like, "Oh, do you guys have them there? Like, what are they like?"
Yeah.
I'm like, they're just like you
Like
and
just like
me.
everybody else.
Yeah, I mean, like they were like jeans. I don't know what to tell you, dude. You know, I'm like, I don't know what you want me to tell you. They're expecting something kind of off the wall. People living in teepees or I don't, and that's what people think. I'm
I've been
sure
asked
that's what they
that
think.
too.
Really, you have?
Yeah.
Was that in New
Not
York?
not recently, but I
Okay.
remember when I was a kid living in California, I got
Yeah.
that a lot. People were like, "Oh, do you live in teepees?" I'm like, and then that's the thing too, right? Like they think all native people like are the same when there's like a vast
Hmm.
array of different tribes and cultures and languages and everything.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's this again, this myth that when the Europeans arrived here, and I mean, obviously, it's very difficult to not go in the past, but that there wasn't already like these complex relationships and societies between, and then relationships between tribes and a ton of different things, right? It's almost yeah, the whole idea of just like they need to be saved, and it's
Yeah.
irritating to me that they people think, oh no, like there was nothing here, and that's not the case. I mean, you've
Yeah.
always been here, right? So going back to
I,
kind of where we were, yeah, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, I was talking to somebody at work a
Hmm.
couple of weeks ago who's also a person of color, and I was, you know, like when I see other people of color on set, especially because we're so like covered up now, and I'm
Yeah,
like, everybody thinks I'm white because I know I look white. It's fine, but
sure, sure.
I was like talking to this guy, and he was really sweet and he meant really well, but at one point he used the phrase like, "Yeah, it's really cool. Like, it's like you're the last of a dying breed," and I was like I understood his intention was like he was trying to like praise it, but I
He's
was
trying to
like,
be like
that
you're
is
very unique,
so,
right? But it
yeah,
was
I'm like, that is
totally
the wrong verbiage, my friend. So but it's like, but also I'm like, that's the way people think about it. Like,
right. Like there's so few of them that like yeah, in like it's it's so weird. I mean, it's so strange to think of that, right? And it's I mean, being out there, yeah, being a person of well, it's the East Coast is a very different place than it is
so
out here in
different.
the West, right? It's a I've never felt more watched or anything like that. Not necessarily in New York City or even in New York, maybe upstate, but like in Boston and New England, I've felt very watched, very marginalized. And I almost kind of got this happiness that came over me when I saw another person of color, right?
Oh
And,
yeah,
and I get to talk to
absolutely.
you, and I'm like, oh, hey, like, like we
Yeah,
should be friends because we understand each other's situation. I mean,
totally.
how are you dealing with all of that? Is that a thing for you right now?
Yeah, I've had moments like that too, like on the last show I was working on.
Yeah.
I I made friends with a few like women of color on set, and
Hmm.
then like, or we would see each other in passing, and then I remember like at our wrap party I had a couple of women come up to me and ask me like, what are you, like, I know that you're mixed something, you know, like,
Yeah.
and I feel like that's that thing where it's like we recognize each other,
Hmm.
um even though white people tend to assume that I'm white. So it's like I definitely have like a unique lens in that way, I guess.
Yeah. Do you think you have
Um
a white voice?
you know, okay, here's the thing that I've learned about myself.
Mm.
Since my mom and I moved so much when I was young,
Oh, okay.
I think that like my like I it's code switching, right? Like
Hmm. Yeah.
I think that my voice and the way that I speak changes depending on whom I'm around, and I don't mean to do it, but
Yeah.
it happens. And
Yeah.
so when I'm at work, and especially after like being in isolation for 6 months and then like going back to work and like having to put on my customer service voice basically like all day,
Mhm. Yeah.
I noticed myself saying some words like the old school, like New York Teamsters. And I'm like, I don't mean to talk like that. It just happens.
Yeah, yeah, I
But
can imagine
yeah,
that. Hmm.
I think definitely like depending on who I'm talking to, it's like sometimes even a subconscious thing. It's like,
Yeah.
and I think we do that as people. It's like, how can I make myself like more palatable for this person? How can I not make this person
Hmm.
uncomfortable,
Making
And I
myself
don't,
wider, yeah, to not be like marginalized and to survive, right? It's a survival mechanism to try to blend in.
oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, you have a very unique experience, I think, because you are not only just a woman of color, but you're a Native American woman, right? So I hardly expect you to speak for all Native American people or indigenous
Yeah.
peoples of the Americas, right? Um, but what do you first like? What how do you perceive is the experience of the Native American today?
Um, I think that this year specifically, I feel
Mm,
like, along with the Black Lives Matter movement,
yeah.
there's been kind of this outpouring of solidarity for that. And
Okay.
I think that at least in like the circles that I
Yeah.
am in, there's this really big tie between Indigenous sovereignty and Black liberation.
Mm,
And so I think that, I don't know, but it's different in the Southwest, right? So I think specifically, like in the Southwest, a lot of um, people I know are just, I don't know, like going back to that rhetoric and holding their ground.
yeah.
um,
Yeah.
like it was just election season, which is a tricky time because I feel like I know a lot of, as much as I push voting, of course, because of
Hmm.
who my mom is and everything, but
I don't know about that.
I
We'll have
know,
to come back to that.
yeah, I know a lot of Indigenous folks that didn't vote because they
Mm,
did not want to participate in this like colonial system of the election, and I can't
mm.
blame them for that. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so it's tricky because we want sovereignty, but, and maybe this is like coming from my own privilege, right? But I feel like
Mm.
at certain points we also have to participate in order to make changes happen. So
Yeah. Yeah.
um so it's a lot of layers and I think that there's a lot of there's a lot of different perspectives, but also I think the cool thing about this modern era is we have this technology and
Hmm.
we can connect with Indigenous people from all over. Like for example, on
Yeah.
election night when
Yeah.
CNN was listing all of the categories of
Yeah.
the different ethnic groups that were voting. I don't know if it
Hmm.
was specifically in Arizona or where it was, but they, instead of labeling Native American, they just labeled it something else.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah.
But like because Native people in general, like Native humor is so unique, and the amount of like memes that churned out about us being called something else was like hilarious. Like so
Hmm.
it was hilarious, even though the reason was so like stupid. You know what
It's
I
like
mean?
in a self-deprecating sort of way. Yeah.
Yeah, but it was
Yeah.
like, but I feel like even that shows the example of like, we all consider each other kin. And I
Hmm.
don't know, like I genuinely don't know if many other groups of people do that.
Yeah.
But it's like
Yeah.
when but because of the struggles we've been through, because
Hmm.
of um just the experience in general, I think that when
Hmm.
we see other Native people, we automatically like kind of consider them family.
I mean, that makes sense, right? Because you then you have, speaking from my personal experience, like Hispanic people in New Mexico really don't like Mexicans.
Yeah.
So, and I mean, basically the same. And there's just this kind of resistance and like I very, very much felt ashamed of being Mexican, not because I didn't want, because I was ashamed of my Mexicanness, but it was because I was wanting to fit in with my new Mexican
Oh yeah.
Hispanic counterparts, right? So it's that's awesome. I mean, that's really great that there is kind of this kinship, like you said, between you all, right? And that's not something. I guess it's a testament to kind of the common history in violence, right? And having a band together to kind
To
of,
protect each other, I think,
yeah,
you
yeah,
know, like
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
So I mean, I think that's really great. And the whole sovereignty thing, I understand. I think that's my very idealistic way of looking at things, of wanting to just be like, well, yeah, like just tear it down, man. Like I'm not going to partake in the system that's oppressed me for so long. But then how do you deconstruct it if you're not, if you're just letting it kind of exist? You actively have to be anti it, right?
Right, like it's going to affect you like
Mm-hmm.
in some way, I
Right.
think.
Yeah. So
So,
might as well make an effort. And something I saw very interesting was that in Arizona, one of the counties, which is where the Navajo Nation is, essentially, it was all blue, right?
mhm.
And I don't
Yeah.
think I think I know that's a big part, in large portion, to like the Native American population that was impacted by COVID as well, right?
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think that's my assumption, right? I'm just connecting the dots here.
Yeah, I think it was a lot of the native vote, a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
native vote and the black
Mm-hmm.
vote
Mm-hmm.
that turned the election around,
Yeah,
honestly.
in these key states, right? Arizona was a big one. It was a huge
Mhm.
one. How long we were waiting for? Way too long. That was the longest election I've ever experienced, and hopefully
It was
it'll
that
be the
week was
longest
just
ever.
like so stressful.
What was
Ugh.
I saw my favorite meme of the whole time, that whole week, was Bill Murray waking up and saying it's election day again.
Yeah. It's
Right,
election day again. I
again.
know, like Groundhog Day.
Yeah, exactly. And
Ugh.
but it was something very interesting that came out with somebody's, commentator on, I think it was on MSNBC. She said, African American woman, mind you, she said, when are people going to realize that they need to stop pandering to the white vote, right? Because it's only going to get you two more percent from 40 to 42. The people who bring
Mhm.
this election across, the finish line for the Democrats is going to be the Black Latino vote, right? And
Yeah.
indigenous vote, as we saw in this last election, right? The Native American vote. So it's a very important kind of populace that people, for some reason, just make the other, right? Something
Yeah.
else.
Yeah.
And they're
And
like,
it's like, no,
it's not
we're
important.
here. And we all like when we all speak up,
Mm-hmm.
that's
Yeah.
when
Well, absolutely. I mean,
differences start to be made.
what was, I mean, obviously people have been making moves, and to state the obvious, Native American people have been here for a long time and part of the American story. Um, when did you start seeing this kind of more the shift in your kind of lifetime as to gaining visibility, and kind of a movement and awareness around Native American people socially, and just, regarding social justice, I guess?
um, I would say I started noticing it
Mm-hmm.
around 2000, like I want to say like the end of high school, beginning of college for me. I
Okay.
graduated high school in 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I was an intern at the Obama campaign at the time. And
Nice.
I I don't know, I feel like and that's when like social media kind of started to pick up.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's when I started to feel like less alone. Because I've always
Oh,
like,
okay.
I've always like, again, I have a unique experience because I'm mixed, because like I was the whitest kid at my elementary school in Laguna. And I always kind of like felt like I didn't count. Like I always kind of,
Mm-hmm.
because of my privilege or whatever, I guess I just like never felt like I was native enough. Like I was too white to be brown and too brown to be white, sort of
Right.
thing, which we've
Right.
talked about before,
The dualism. Yeah.
Um, yeah, but I think that realizing that like there's not just one way to be native, right? That everyone's identity is valid, even those folks that maybe were adopted out of their tribe or like have were disconnected from it in some way due to colonialism. But all of those identities are just as valid. And once I started to, just be on the internet and see people writing about, how blood quantum is bullshit and how not all native folks look the same too. I think that that's kind of when I started to
Mm.
gain this awareness
Yeah.
and see other people gaining awareness too,
Okay. So, I mean, the blood
so
quantum thing is a very interesting thing, right?
yeah.
Because I see so many, as there's certain groups, tribes that are very stringent about it, and others that are not.
Hmm.
Um, you say it's kind of bullshit.
Yeah. Well,
What is that?
it's because so like when assimilation was becoming a thing, right?
Mm-hmm,
Like
mm-hmm.
the whole rhetoric was kill the Indian, save the man.
Right.
So like both of my great grandparents were taken to a boarding school,
Mm-hmm,
taken from their family. They didn't see their family for like 6 years or something. Um, they cut their hair, they changed, they give them a
mm-hmm,
Catholic name, and the whole goal was to strip all of these children of their identities so that they could, you
mm-hmm.
know, be Americans, quote
Right.
unquote.
Right.
Um, and so, and I'm not an expert on the history of this,
No, I mean,
but
more so than I
it,
am. It's your
yeah.
history, right?
but, um, but like, for example, at most pueblos, you have to be at least a quarter to be enrolled.
Mm-hmm,
I'm a quarter pueblo, but I'm
mm-hmm.
an eighth Laguna and an eighth Jemez, so I cannot be enrolled in either one. So I have
Oh,
my CIB, which says like how much Indian blood I have, but I
jeez.
don't have a tribal enrollment card. Um, and I don't know, like it's the exclusion is just like unnecessary,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
think.
It's just semantics at this point. I mean, you're obviously native, right?
Yeah. But I think, and I don't know, I wish I had done more research on this, but I know that just excluding people or like trying to like,
Mm-hmm.
cut those bloodlines and see who counts as native and who doesn't, it, it hurts everybody, I think. So
Yeah, yeah. I mean, but you also don't want to just be letting anybody in who do you think about that? I mean, do you feel like, I
that's
mean,
true.
Liz
Yeah. And I
Liz
know
Warren,
like
I mean
some,
Liz Warren, right? The famous
right,
example
like, and
from
I
this
know,
last year.
yeah, and a lot of like a lot of joke in a lot of native communities too is
Mm-hmm,
like, and I've literally heard this from people,
mm-hmm.
is when I tell people I'm native, like there's some white kid in my class who's like, my grandma was a Cherokee princess. Like, oh, so many native people have heard that, and it's like, yeah, right, you know.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
it's, and I think the thing that I've seen a lot of folks say that makes the most sense to me is if your community claims you, if your people claim you, then you know, that's it.
Yeah.
I
No,
think
that
because
makes
when I
sense.
go when I go home, when I
Yeah.
go back, like I've been participating in feast days and everything like since I
Mm-hmm,
was a kid,
mm-hmm.
and people know me. People know me when I go home.
Yeah, I mean, yeah,
Um,
yeah,
or if not me, they know who my grandma is. That's another.
yeah.
It's like, oh, you're from this pueblo. Who's your grandma?
We're like, oh
So
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, that makes sense. I think a lot of and I only because I know this from, like, for example, the Dominican Republic, right? This is something that happened there. The quick catch up on that, in the DR, there's the white supremacy runs deep in their psyche, right?
Hmm.
and they essentially, anybody that's black is actually Haitian, so they actually, to an extent, they'll deport them even though they're Dominican. And if they're light skinned, they say that they're, I can't remember the name, but they're the indigenous people, when in reality those people were wiped out completely. There's none of them left, and they do it as a kind of a claim to the land, saying, no, we've been here, so
Hmm.
this is our land, so therefore we can do whatever we want with it. And it's kind of this weird, obsession with the land. So they claim the culture, but in reality they want nothing to do with it, you know.
Yeah.
And it's what's extremely racist and it's ridiculous to think that, right? um
Yeah, and those, and it's
mhm.
crazy. So, this is kind of related to something I was thinking about the other day. Is
Yeah.
it's crazy that I started taking Spanish classes. Like I started learning Spanish when I was in sixth grade, when I was like on a scholarship at the academy.
Hmm.
But and I had a white Spanish teacher, probably for more grades
Hmm.
than I had
Hmm.
like a native speaker.
Hmm.
Um, but it was not until I took a Latin American studies class in college that I like realized that
Hmm.
the reason all of these South American, Latin American countries speak Spanish is because the colonizers came from Spain. Like
Really?
it took me that long to like
Oh,
put the pieces together just because I didn't ever, because it's not talked about ever. Like why would
no,
they,
it's not.
but
It's
the
not talked
reason they
about.
wanted to call it Latin America is so all of these European countries that spoke Latin based languages could claim the land. And it's
Hmm.
like,
Hmm. Yeah, the whole title Latin America is very, it's an othering and grouping them all together when really they're different groups, right? As well,
yeah.
which is also a very interesting thing when you kind of dive deeper into it. Um, and then in Latin America, there's there is until this day this kind of this idealization of being of their European ancestry over their indigenous one,
Hmm.
right? So I'm like 75% Latin indigenous. So it's like Mesoamerican and Andean. And I got the results. I showed it to my parents' extended family, my mom's extended
Did you do
family.
like the DNA thing?
Yeah, I did one of those, right? And it was obvious. I mean, I knew that, right? We've been in Mexico for a long time.
Yeah.
And so I did that, and they were just in denial about it. They're like, no, 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 we're definitely more European. We're this and that, and I think the test is wrong. And this denial about the fact that like this is your heritage, man. Like this is
That's
obviously
so
like,
wild.
yeah, to the extent to where like, and I don't know if I mentioned this to you, but like in Mexico, being called, they call them indios, right? But being called that is a derogatory term. It's you're considered uneducated and poor, right? So it's like, if you want to insult somebody, you call them that, and it's insane. It's absolutely insane. But that happens all the time. So it's I also don't think I can claim it because that's not my experience. Just like I can't claim my African ancestry, right? Um,
Right.
I'm a Mexican American man at the end of the day, and that's how I'm perceived or seen. So
Hmm.
it's you really shouldn't be going around saying your grandmother was a Cherokee princess.
I know. Well, and
Right.
I kind of feel that way the opposite way because like I don't have a relationship with my biological father. I never
Hmm.
have.
Hmm.
And that's where a lot of my whiteness comes from. So
Yeah.
I'm like I don't really consider myself that
I
even though
mean,
that
should you
is
go
how I'm
around?
perceived by
You
a lot
should
of
go around
people.
saying like your great grandmother was a European princess.
Yeah. My
You
great
know,
grandmother was a Scotch Irish princess.
there you go. So I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of subjects that kind of lead back to something obviously about your mom, like a lot of what drives her. And without spending too much time on her as a topic, having been able to kind of interview her, a big part of her goal in getting into politics, what ended up leading her down this path was, according to her, was trying to get people to participate and vote, right?
Hmm.
These apathetic individuals on the pueblos or in other parts of New Mexico to actually register to vote and vote.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
and it's partially that, but it's also partially that, you know, a
mhm,
lot of Native folks have historically have not been given the information they need to vote. It's not accessible
yeah,
to them as much as it is to us, you know, or
right.
like people in more urban areas, I mean.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
um yeah, and she's like, before she was in this position,
Hmm.
when she was the native vote director at in the Obama campaign, re-election campaign in 2012. We kind of
Hmm.
like were coworkers in a way. Um,
Nice.
but that was a lot of her job, was like
Hmm.
driving out to the pueblos, driving out to these more rural areas, and connecting with people to do that. So it's partially that, but also, yeah, like just getting out the vote.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's an important part of it, right? Um, and I want to ask your perspective because, I mean, objectively, I try to look at it as objectively as I can, and I think I've always grown up with it in New Mexico and kind of understanding about pueblos and feast days and the little things, right? But I think in kind of in this century, the 21st century, I started seeing a shift around the same time or a little bit after, the this kind of shift towards like social movements and social justice started happening in the 2010s, right?
Mhm.
More around like the middle of the Obama era, and this shift towards kind of this lens towards the marginalized peoples. Um, you just mentioned you worked with your mom on this campaign, right, for Obama's reelection in 2012. I mean, you can speak to it as her daughter, but as your own kind of individual person, because you two are individual adults at the end of the day. Um, what was it like, kind of getting this insider view into the development of this individual and becoming one of the first two, Native American women elected to Congress? What was that like for you?
Um, well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is that her journey to get there was not one, it was completely selfless.
Hmm. Hmm.
And she, you know, as Pueblo people, we have these like core values that are taught to us from a young
Hmm.
age,
Hmm.
values of community, values of giving, value,
Yeah.
something that we say a lot at Pueblo Action Alliance is, everything for everyone and nothing for me. Like, it's really about
Hmm.
taking care of the whole. And so watching her take that journey, like, it was obvious to me that that's where it was coming from. And in a way, I like almost didn't even, it wasn't until like the primary election night that I really honestly like registered how big of a deal it was, like on a larger scale,
Hmm.
you know? Um, but because and like Pueblo people are very humble.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, we're
Hmm.
not we're not taught to like talk about ourselves, or like, which is sometimes hard because it takes a lot to like get
Hmm.
up and, you know,
Speak.
advocate for yourself sometimes.
Yeah.
Um, but my mom has that skill. So
Hmm.
just, yeah, watching her get there, it was just obvious that everything that she's been taught from being a Pueblo woman is what pushed her to get to that point.
That's good.
And then once she did get there, like once we went to DC, it was also obvious that nobody had really seen,
Hmm.
like Native people, especially Native women, in a position like that.
Really?
Yeah. So
I mean, what was your experience? Yeah.
especially on like when she got sworn in and we were all like wearing our
Hmm.
traditional clothes that
Hmm.
we're just like used to wearing, but walking through the Capitol building, people were like, whoa, like people were like literally like
Parting.
made a path and we were just like walking through.
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
and so that was just an interesting moment because I'm like, oh, like even as a New Mexican, you know, like you
Hmm.
said, like you see Pueblo art everywhere. Like you
Yeah.
see, especially in Albuquerque, like you see
Hmm.
these things. all the time. You see
Mm-hmm.
Native people around all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the East Coast is different. And it was
Yeah,
obvious that a lot of people just like hadn't seen Native folks before.
yeah. I mean, that's a very real thing. It's how has I mean, how did that experience shifted how you look at the world now as a Native woman?
Well, it was the first time that I really, like, that week was the first time that I really realized that the East Coast, this side of the country,
Mm-hmm.
was colonized so much earlier than the Southwest. Like,
Mm-hmm.
that was just something I had never really thought about before.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt incredibly privileged to have so much of my community, my pueblo, our traditions, our language, everything so intact.
Yeah.
Um, when here, there's like not really any traces of it, you know.
Yeah.
I enjoy living here, and it's challenging and everything, but like every day I wake up and I think about how this just used to be, like Manhattan, Brooklyn, all of this just used to be green, like luscious land,
Yeah.
you
Like a
know,
literal
that
island.
was
Yeah.
that was stewarded by Native people who knew how to take care of it. And so yeah, the imagery of colonization is just much more present here.
Mm.
um but also I've met a lot more you know, like mixed alternative looking
Hmm.
Native people who are like me. So yeah, it's been a mixed bag of experiences.
Yeah, no, I can imagine. It's a big deal. It's not, I mean, I think your presence and your existence is in large part, and your pride around it as well as kind of bringing visibility, you know, even if it's a, like on a granular scale, like a scale with who you interact with on a daily basis in the film industry, honestly, right? Because how many Native people work in the film industry?
Exactly. And like that's
Yeah.
something I've been thinking about. Like I've been having a lot of, you know, it's been hard for me coming back to work, to be honest.
Hmm.
And especially just after all of the events of this year, like every day I'm like, I should be doing this. I should be contributing to my
Mm-hmm.
community more. I should be,
Yeah.
I don't have time. And I like feel this like enormous sense of guilt. But at the same time, I, you
Yeah.
know, I very much speak my opinion all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that even just being around my coworkers, um, I, you know, try to educate them, even just
Yeah.
in small ways.
Yeah.
And I think that, yeah, like me, and I think it's important for people like me to exist in a space like that,
Mm-hmm.
because if
Yeah.
not me, like who else? You know, it's
Yeah.
the representation aspect of it too. So
Yeah, absolutely. It's a big part of it. You know, just like our, our now vice president elect is, you know, bringing that visibility and that kind of the understanding that, you know, sending that message to young women of color that this is possible, that you can do this as well, right? And
yeah,
you know, just because it's the film industry and it's the lower tier job right now doesn't mean it won't be higher later on, right? Or you won't be able to kind of develop in that industry later on, because you know, especially with film and my understanding of it, and I having worked in it, it's male dominated for one, and then women of color, shoot, you know,
it is.
so it's a big deal that you're even there, right?
Yeah.
Also, don't, in my understanding of being like one of the only people of color in a white industry or setting, it could be a lot. I feel like a lot of pressure and responsibility. So I mean, check in with yourself.
It is. And it's hard, and it's
Yeah.
hard in like
Yeah.
the way that, you know, I feel like a
Hmm.
lot of my coworkers can just like wake up and do their job. Not saying that like everybody doesn't have their own struggles, of course,
Sure.
but
Sure.
like every day my mental space is like
Mhm.
at least 80% filled with just like thinking about
Mhm.
like how fucked up the world is, and like how much colonization and capitalism and all of these
Oof.
systems are like ruining everything, and
I
how like
know.
I come from this like long line of ancestors who have suffered in order for me to get here, and like And I'm like, okay, even if I do have privilege in a lot of ways, like a lot of people I think that I interact with on a daily basis, like also don't have this like emotional burden that they're carrying
Mm-hmm.
constantly,
Mm-hmm.
you know? Um, so it's just, yeah, it's just an interesting experience. But, you know, I'm grateful for, like, because I am still working with Pueblo Action Alliance, and because everyone's having their meetings on Zoom these days anyway.
Mm-hmm.
um, it's nice that I can stay grounded
Yeah.
in that way while still working with them from afar. So I'm very, very grateful for that.
Good. Good. And then everyone who's listening, make sure to go support them. What's the?
Yeah.
Do they have a
Mhm.
website, right?
Yeah, it's puebloactionalliance.org.
Uh-huh.
And you can follow us on Instagram as well. We just hit
Nice.
10K and we're doing a giveaway, so go enter that.
What?
Yeah.
That's
So
awesome.
yeah.
Thank you so much for coming on. We'll debrief right now in a second, but you guys, thank you so much for listening. I really appreciate it.
Thank
Um,
you.
all right.